everyone! Welcome to Literature Revision with Mr. Johnston. Today, we're continuing our summary of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We are making a three-part video series summarising this novel. Our first video went through chapters 1 to 3. This video will summarise chapters 4 to 8. Now remember, our plan is to make sure that you finish these videos knowing the story inside out. So, let's begin. Chapter 4. The Carew Murder Case. Stevenson begins chapter 4 by describing a very peaceful scene. One night, a young maid looks out her window. She looks out upon a beautiful view of London. The moon is shining down upon the buildings, and all seems well. She then sees an elderly gentleman walking down the road. This gentleman has a long, white, flowing beard, and looks like a very wise, respectable, kind old man. She then sees a dark figure approaching this old man. This is Mr. Hyde. The two men begin a conversation. The old man is very polite and friendly to Mr. Hyde. But then something terrible happens. Mr. Hyde suddenly, for no understandable reason, clubs the old man to the ground with his cane. And then Mr. Hyde stamps and beats the old man to death. The maid faints, having watched these horrific sights. The police find the old man's body, and they discover a letter addressed to Utterson in his hand. Utterson arrives to the crime scene and identifies the body as Sir Danvers Carew. Carew is a well-known and well-respected Member of Parliament. Utterson also identifies the murder weapon as Dr. Jekyll's cane. Upon the maid's description of this incident, it's clear that Mr. Hyde was the murderer. Utterson remembers that he has Hyde's address. So if you have a very good memory, you might remember that in chapter 2, Utterson met Hyde outside a sinister-looking building, and Hyde gave Utterson his address for his flat in Soho. So the next morning, Utterson and a police inspector travel across London towards Hyde's flat in order to arrest this villain. A strange fog has passed upon the city, covering it in darkness. It's nearly like nature is mourning the death of Carew. Utterson and the police inspector travel across London to Soho. This is a disreputable area of the capital. It is a place of immorality, sin, and filth. A fitting place for a villain like Hyde to live. They enter Hyde's apartment, but he is not there. His apartment is chaotic. It is clear that Mr. Hyde left in a hurry. However, the police do find one clue. They find the charred remains of a checkbook. Using this checkbook, the police identify Hyde's bank. The police then wait outside Hyde's bank for weeks to catch him, but he never arrives. Hyde has disappeared completely. The police begin to question different people in London to try to find Hyde, but this search for Hyde seems pointless. He has no family. He has never been photographed before. No one can describe Hyde's appearance. Right, let's now revise the key ideas of chapter 4, the Carew murder case. A maid watches Mr. Hyde beat an elderly gentleman to death with a cane. She faints, having seen these horrific sights. The police find a letter to Utterson in the old man's hand. Utterson identifies the body as Sir Danvers Carew, a well-known Member of Parliament. Utterson identifies the murder weapon as Jekyll's cane. Utterson leads the police to Hyde's apartment in Soho. Hyde is not there, but they do find Hyde's charged checkbook. The police wait outside Hyde's bank for weeks to catch him, but he never arrives. Hyde has disappeared completely. The search for Hyde seems pointless. He has no family. He has never been photographed. No one can describe his appearance. But there we go. It's now time to test your memory. You have 45 seconds to fill in the key words. Off you go. And now, on to our second set of sentences. 45 seconds again, off you go. Let's now see how well you have done. Chapter 4. The Carew Murder Case. A maid watches Mr. Hyde beat an elderly gentleman to death with a cane. She faints having seen these horrific sights. The police find a letter to Utterson in the old man's hand. Utterson identifies the body as Sir Danvers Carew, a well-known member of Parliament. Utterson identifies the murder weapon as Jekyll's cane. Utterson leads the police to Hyde's apartment in Soho. Hyde is not there, but they do find Hyde's charged chequebook. The police wait outside Hyde's bank for weeks to catch him, but he never arrives. Hyde has disappeared completely. The search for Hyde seems pointless. He has no family. He has never been photographed. No one can describe his appearance. Well done if you got full marks there. Now, on to Chapter 5. Incident of the letter. Utterson is now very worried for Jekyll's safety. He knows that Jekyll is associating with the crazed murderer, Mr. Hyde. Let's just revise everything Utterson now knows about Hyde. Firstly, you may remember that Jekyll's will says that all of his property will pass to Hyde if Jekyll dies or disappears. Secondly, Utterson now knows that Hyde is very dangerous. Hyde trampled on the young girl in Chapter 1 and murdered Sir Danvers Carew in Chapter 4. With this knowledge of Hyde, Utterson becomes worried. Will Jekyll be Hyde's next victim? Well, Utterson goes to Jekyll's house, and thankfully his friend is still alive. But Jekyll is looking deadly sick. His health has strangely deteriorated after Carew's murder. At this point, Utterson now worries that Jekyll might have hidden Hyde. Perhaps Jekyll is trying to protect Hyde from the police. But Jekyll reassures Utterson that this is not the case. Jekyll says that he will never see Hyde again. He also says that Hyde is quite safe. To reassure Utterson that he is being truthful, Jekyll gives Utterson a note from Hyde to confirm this. Before Utterson leaves, he has a word with Poole. Poole says that no messengers have delivered such a note that day. So where did this note come from? Utterson gives Hyde's note to his clerk, Mr. Guest. Now, Mr. Guest is an expert at inspecting handwriting. Mr. Guest compares Jekyll's handwriting to Hyde's, and he discovers that they are both identical. Utterson now believes that Jekyll forged a note to protect Hyde. The reader may now wonder, is Jekyll working with Hyde? Okay, let's now revise the key things that happen in Chapter 5, Incident of the Letter. Utterson goes to Jekyll's house. He finds Jekyll looking deadly sick. Jekyll says that he will never see Hyde again. Jekyll also says that Hyde is quite safe. Jekyll gives Utterson a note from Hyde to confirm this, but Poole says that no messengers have delivered such a note that day. Utterson's clerk, Mr. Guest, says that Hyde's handwriting is nearly identical to Jekyll's. Let's now test your knowledge of Chapter 5. Fill in the key words. You have 1 minute. Okay, let's see how well we have done. Chapter 5. Incident of the Letter. Utterson goes to Jekyll's house. He finds Jekyll looking deadly sick. Jekyll says that he will never see Hyde again. Jekyll says that Hyde is quite safe. Jekyll gives Utterson a note from Hyde to confirm this, but Poole says that no messengers have delivered such a note that day. Utterson's clerk, Mr. Guest, says that Hyde's handwriting is nearly identical to Jekyll's. Well done if you got full marks. Let's now go on to Chapter 6. The remarkable incident of Dr. Lanyon. Hyde has disappeared. Without Hyde's influence, Jekyll's health and happiness return. He becomes sociable again. He even holds a dinner party with his friends, Lanyon and Utterson. Some of you might remember Chapter 2, in which Lanyon says that he has fallen out with Jekyll over scientific matters. Well, it seems that they have now reconciled and are friends once again. All seems to be going well. But one day, Utterson arrives at Jekyll's house and is turned away by Poole. Jekyll doesn't want visitors. This happens several times. Jekyll has begun to seclude himself once again. Has Hyde once again returned to Jekyll's life? Utterson becomes worried and travels to Lanyon for advice. Maybe Lanyon will know why Jekyll has begun to seclude himself. But Utterson finds Lanyon looking very ill. He is about to die. Lanyon says that he has suffered a great shock, but won't reveal more. Clearly Lanyon has seen something truly terrifying to change his previously healthy appearance to this pitiful state. When Utterson mentions their friend Jekyll, Lanyon's face changes. He says that he never wishes to see or talk about Jekyll ever again. What has Lanyon seen? And how was Jekyll involved? Utterson next receives a letter from Jekyll. He agrees that he can no longer be friends with Lanyon. He also says that, from now on, he will live a life of seclusion. Poole later tells Utterson that Jekyll has now confined himself to his cabinet, a room beside his laboratory. So if we take a look at this illustration here, we can see Dr. Jekyll's cabinet towards the top right of the illustration. That is a very small room that is right beside Dr. Jekyll's laboratory. This is where Jekyll has now locked himself. Before Lanyon dies, he sends Utterson an envelope. Lanyon writes that Utterson should not open this envelope until after Jekyll's death or disappearance. Utterson will read this letter in chapter 9. It is only then that the reader will learn about the great shock that Lanyon has suffered. Right, let's now revise chapter 6, the remarkable incident of Dr. Lanyon. Jekyll becomes very sociable for 2 months, but suddenly secludes himself in his cabinet. Dr. Lanyon suddenly falls very ill, having suffered from a great shock. Lanyon says that he will never talk about Jekyll ever again. Before he dies, Lanyon gives Utterson a letter. This is only to be opened after the death or disappearance of Jekyll. Utterson opens this letter in chapter 9. Let's now test your memory. Okay, you have 1 minute. Fill in the key words. Okay, let's see how well we have done. Chapter 6. Remarkable incident of Dr. Lanyon. Jekyll becomes very sociable for 2 months, but suddenly secludes himself in his cabinet. Dr. Lanyon suddenly falls very ill, having suffered from a great shock. Lanyon says that he will never talk about Jekyll ever again. Before he dies, Lanyon gives Utterson a letter. This is only to be opened after the death or disappearance of Jekyll. Utterson opens this letter in chapter 9. Well done if you got all of those right. On to chapter 7. Incident at the window. Utterson and Enfield are out for their walk. Some of you may remember that Utterson and Enfield go for a walk every Sunday. In chapter 1, they saw the sinister-looking building, and Enfield recounted seeing Hyde trample the young girl. Enfield and Utterson decide to pay Dr. Jekyll a visit. Jekyll doesn't want to leave the house, but agrees to have a conversation from his window. The conversation is going well. They're smiling, they're chatting, but then something very strange happens. Suddenly, Jekyll's face changes to a look of horror and despair. He quickly disappears from his window. Shaken by this sight, Enfield and Utterson walk away in silence. So this chapter very much deepens the mystery around Jekyll's strange behaviour. There is a growing sense that something very menacing is at work in the scientist's life. So, that's chapter 7. Let's revise it one more time. Chapter 7, Incident at the Window. Enfield and Utterson visit Dr. Jekyll. Jekyll says that he cannot leave his house, but agrees to talk to them from his window. Suddenly, Jekyll's facial expression changes to one of horror and despair. Jekyll disappears from the window. Shaken by this sight, Enfield and Utterson walk away in silence. Let's now test your memory. Okay, you have 45 seconds to fill in the key words. Off you go. Okay, let's see how well we have done. Chapter 7. Incident at the Window. Enfield and Utterson visits Dr. Jekyll. Jekyll says that he cannot leave his house, but agrees to talk to them from his window. Suddenly, Jekyll's facial expression changes to one of horror and despair. Jekyll disappears from the window. Shaken by the sight, Enfield and Utterson walk away in silence. Well done if you got full marks there. Let's now go on to Chapter 8. The Last Night. One night, Utterson receives a visit from Jekyll's butler, Poole. Poole is very anxious. He asks Utterson to travel to Jekyll's house. Utterson and Poole travel through London through a wild storm. Upon entering the house, Utterson and Poole go to Dr. Jekyll's cabinet. You may remember that Dr. Jekyll has secluded himself in this small room next to the laboratory now for some time. Utterson and Poole gather outside Dr. Jekyll's cabinet and hear a strange voice from within this room. It is not Jekyll's voice. Who could be in there? Poole explains that he has seen a strange man inside the laboratory. This man was clearly Mr. Hyde. Utterson now worries that Hyde may have murdered Jekyll. With an axe, Utterson and Poole break into the cabinet, but they do not find any sign of Dr. Jekyll. Jekyll has disappeared. They do, however, find 4 things. Firstly, they find Hyde's dead body. Hyde's body is still twitching. It's clear he has only been dead for a few minutes. Number 2, Jekyll's will. This has now been changed. Utterson, rather than Hyde, is now the beneficiary of this will. You may remember that Jekyll's will was previously a cause of great concern for Utterson. Jekyll's will was very unusual. It said that all of his property and money would pass to Mr. Hyde if Jekyll died or disappeared. Well, Jekyll has now changed his will. This property and money will no longer go to Hyde, but now to Mr. Utterson instead. Thirdly, they find a note saying that Jekyll has disappeared and telling Utterson to read Dr. Lanyon's letter. Utterson reads Lanyon's letter in Chapter 9. You may remember in Chapter 6, Dr. Lanyon died having suffered a great shock. He gave Utterson a letter with instructions to wait until Jekyll's disappearance or death before reading it. Utterson can now read Lanyon's letter. Fourthly, they find a large document, Dr. Jekyll's confession. This is very much Jekyll's account of his life. Utterson reads this in Chapter 10. Utterson now goes home to read these documents and solve the mystery of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Let's now revise Chapter 8, The Last Night. One night, Poole visits Utterson. They travel through London towards Jekyll's house. A strange voice is coming from Jekyll's cabinet. Poole says that he saw a strange man in Jekyll's laboratory. Utterson and Poole break into Jekyll's cabinet. they find four things. Firstly, Hyde's dead body. Secondly, they find Jekyll's will, which has now been changed. Utterson will be the beneficiary of this will rather than Hyde. Thirdly, a note saying that Utterson should open Lanyon's letter. Utterson will read this in chapter 9. And fourthly, they find Dr. Jekyll's confession. Utterson will read this in chapter 10. Let's now test your memory. You have 45 seconds to go through these key words. Off you go. And on to the next set of sentences. Another 45 seconds. Off you go. Okay, let's see how well we have done. Chapter 8, The Last Night. One night, Poole visits Utterson. They travel through London towards Jekyll's house. A strange voice is coming from Jekyll's cabinet. Poole says that he saw a strange man in Jekyll's laboratory. Utterson and Poole break into Jekyll's cabinet. They find four things. Firstly, they find Hyde's dead body. Secondly, they find Jekyll's will, which has now been changed. Utterson will be the beneficiary of this will rather than Hyde. Thirdly, they find a note saying that Utterson should open Lanyon's letter. Utterson will read this in chapter 9. And fourthly, Dr. Jekyll's confession. Utterson will read this in chapter 10. Well done if you got all of those right. Now on to our lesson summary. We have now finished summarizing chapters 4 to 8. But how much do you remember? We are going to go through the key events of each chapter one last time before we hold our final quiz for this video. Let's begin. Right, let's now go through the key ideas of each of these four chapters, beginning with chapter 4, the Carew murder case. Hyde kills Sir Danvers Carew with Jekyll's cane. The police search through Hyde's flat in Soho, but he is nowhere to be seen. Chapter 5, Incident of the Letter. Utterson visits a sickly Jekyll. Jekyll says that he will never see Hyde again. Utterson's clerk, Mr. Guest, inspects a note from Hyde and says that Jekyll's handwriting is nearly identical to Hyde's. Chapter 6, Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon. Jekyll becomes sociable for 2 months, but suddenly secludes himself in his cabinet. Lanyon becomes seriously ill, having suffered a great shock. Lanyon writes Utterson a letter saying that the lawyer should only open it after Jekyll has died or disappeared. Chapter 7, Incident at the Window. Jekyll talks to Utterson and Enfield from his window. Jekyll's facial expression suddenly changes to one of horror and despair before he disappears. Chapter 8, The Last Night. Poole brings Utterson to Jekyll's cabinet. There is a strange voice coming from the room. They break into the cabinet only to find: number 1, Hyde's dead body. Number 2, Jekyll's will, which has now been changed. Utterson will be the beneficiary of this will rather than Hyde. Number 3, a note saying Utterson should open Lanyon's letter. And number 4, Dr. Jekyll's confession. Let's now test your memory on chapters 4 to 8. You now have 1 minute to go through these first 3 chapters. Off you go. And now another minute for the next set of sentences. Okay, let's see how well we have done. Chapter 4, the Carew murder case. Hyde kills Sir Danvers Carew with Jekyll's cane. The police search through Hyde's flat in Soho, but he is nowhere to be seen. Chapter 5, incident of the letter. Utterson visits a sickly Jekyll. Jekyll says that he will never see Hyde again. Utterson's clerk, Mr. Guest, inspects a note from Hyde and says that Jekyll's handwriting is nearly identical to Hyde's. Chapter 6, remarkable incident of Dr. Lanyon. Jekyll becomes sociable for 2 months, but suddenly secludes himself in his cabinet. Lanyon becomes seriously ill, having suffered a great shock. Lanyon writes Utterson a letter saying that the lawyer should only open it after Jekyll has died or disappeared. Chapter 7, incident at the window. Jekyll talks to Utterson and Enfield from his window. Jekyll's facial expression suddenly changes to one of horror and despair before he disappears. Chapter 8, the last night. Poole brings Utterson to Jekyll's cabinet. There is a strange voice coming from a room. They break into the cabinet only to find Hyde's dead body, Jekyll's will, which has now been changed. Utterson will be a beneficiary of this will rather than Hyde. A note saying that Utterson should open Lanyon's letter, and Dr. Jekyll's confession. Well done if you got all of those right. You should now know chapters 4 to 8 inside out. Okay, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I will let you know when I will bring out my final one, summarising Jekyll and Hyde on chapters 9 and 10. But until that time, all the best.